Hello, everyone. Welcome to Living History and the last installment of these special podcasts that I've done from around the world over this Anzac Day period. It's been quite an extraordinary trip for me. I visited 4 or 5 different countries and studied several different wars, from the First World War of Gallipoli through the Second World War in London, walking around the sites from the Blitz in World War II. So look out for a future documentary coming out about that. And now I'm sitting in my hotel room in Vietnam, having spent a fantastic week exploring the Vietnam War, which is really one of my favourites. If you haven't been to Vietnam, you should seriously consider doing it, because it's not only a wonderful place, but that history from the war is absolutely incredible. And speaking of incredible, I had a wonderful day today, which I wanted to share with you because it was quite extraordinary. I headed out to Long Tan yesterday, Australia's most famous battlefield of the war, and I took a group out there yesterday, and we spent a bit of time looking around the battlefield, but it wasn't enough for me. I wanted to get there and explore a bit more and spend some time actually following in the footsteps of the Aussies who fought at Long Tan back in August 1966. And I was able to do that today, and it was absolutely incredible. So I wanted to share with you just that experience of walking that ground at Long Tan. It's a remarkable battlefield. It was a really incredible experience to walk the ground. So in the morning, I met up with my wonderful local guide, Tuan, who has lived in this area for much of his life and knows the Australian battlefields very, very well. If you come on a tour with us, you will meet Tuan, because he is our local guy down in the Vung Tau region, which was the Australian base of operations southeast of Saigon throughout the war. So I met Tuan in the morning, and we drove out to Nui Dat, the old Australian base, or very nearby to Nui Dat. Now, the geography of the battlefield has changed significantly since 1966, because in about 1990, they built a huge dam right in the middle of the area of operations where the Australian troops had operated from Nui Dat. And that's really changed the layout of the battlefield a little bit. You can't quite now follow in the footsteps of Delta Company of 6 RAR, who fought in the Battle of Long Tan. You can't follow in their footsteps when they left the Nui Dat base, because basically it's a big lake in the way now. But we started on the edge of the lake, and we walked as much as we could in the footsteps of Delta Company. And it was really lovely. It was really picturesque walking through light jungle. It was hot. The red dirt, the famous red dirt from the Nui Dat area, was absolutely everywhere. Farmers had been working and ploughing the fields. There was a lot of red dirt everywhere, a lot of dust. It was really quite atmospheric, and straight away, being in the jungle, in the heat, seeing this red dust, you really felt that you had stepped straight into one of those photos from the 1960s at Nui Dat. So we walked around the lake, and we headed for the battlefield at Long Tan. And as we got closer, it started to make a bit more sense to me. The geography, I could see the big rubber plantations, which are a key feature of this area, small areas of jungle, farmers' fields, and eventually we got right up to the edge of the Long Tan battle. And the Long Tan battle began when the platoons of Delta Company crossed a road at the edge of a rubber plantation. And as they crossed that road, a couple of platoons had gone ahead. As 11 Platoon went across the road, the sergeant, Bob Buick, looked to his right and saw 6 or 7 VC walking down the track towards them, completely unaware that Delta Company was there. They'd completely missed watching the other platoons cross the road, and now Bob Buick emerged just as the VC sort of crested a rise in the road and were coming towards him. And so from about 75 to 100 metres away, he opened fire, fired a couple of shots, killed one of the VC who was walking down the road, and those 2 shots were the first shots of the Battle of Long Tan. When they reported the contact, the interesting thing they said was that these soldiers were wearing green uniforms, but no one at the time picked up on what that meant. That meant, because they were wearing uniforms, it meant that these weren't local guerrillas who they'd been fighting previously. The local guerrillas wore the famous black pajamas. These men were wearing proper green uniforms, and so that suggested they were part of a much larger force, but unfortunately it wasn't picked up on at the time. 11 Platoon then chased this small force, which ran into the rubber plantation. They dragged their dead or wounded comrade away with them, raced into the rubber plantation, and 11 Platoon took off after them. That meant that 11 Platoon got extended way out in front of the rest of the company, and 11 Platoon therefore was in danger of being cut off when the battle really took off in the hours that followed. So it was great to stand on that spot because it's so specific, because 11 Platoon reported we crossed a road right at this point just below the crest of the hill. We encountered the enemy. We killed or wounded one of them and pushed on after them at the rubber plantation. Because they were so specific in that report, you can stand right on that spot today. So I reckon I was within a few metres of where Bob Buick was standing when he fired that shot those 2 shots on the 18th of August, 1966. Incredible. This is what I love about what I do. It's to get out and actually stand on that spot, to do the research firstly, to read all the books and get excited about what you're going to do, and then actually get out there on the ground and find that the ground marries up with the maps and with all the research you've been doing. Absolutely wonderful. I never tire of it. So that was great to identify that spot. And the rubber plantation is a bit thinner than it had been in 1966 because rubber trees last about 20 years and they cut them down and replant them. So it goes from thick rubber plantation to no trees at all, and then trees of varying height while that rubber grows back. So they were full-size trees, but not quite as heavy as they'd been during 1966. But walking into that rubber plantation, as I now did, really gave a good feeling of what the Delta Company boys had to do, because walking through the rubber plantation as opposed to jungle, there's just long, clear corridors where you can see for a very long way because the rubber trees are planted in very neat straight lines. You can see for a very long way in every direction. Great if you're moving through as part of a unit because you can see where your mates are and you can keep in contact with each other, but also not so great because it means the enemy can see you as well. And that's pretty much what happened to Delta Company during the Battle of Long Tan. As they advanced through the rubber plantation, the much larger force, the much larger Viet Cong force that they didn't even realise was there, spotted them, opened fire, and then moved in to surround them. So this was the big problem for Delta Company. There was only about 105 blokes who were advancing to try and find this Viet Cong force. And the Viet Cong had probably in the area about 3,000 men. Now, of those, about, say, 2,000 were involved in the battle, and about 1,000 to 1,500 were actively attacking the Australians during the course of this battle. So the Aussies were outnumbered about 10-1 on the field at Long Tan, and would have been decimated had it not been for the support of particularly artillery. The Australian and New Zealand artillery that fired from Nui Dat was absolutely brilliant and really saved the day, and was essential in stopping the Vietnamese. And most of the casualties caused to the Viet Cong were caused by the artillery firing from Nui Dat. And all the soldiers just raved about how good the artillery was, how accurate it was, and they were dropping shells within, at the start, 100 metres of the Aussies, and then pulling them even closer as the battle went on. So that was where I found myself, in the rubber plantation, right where 11 Platoon had been, and had been chasing this small patrol. As 11 Platoon pushed on, they kept running into more and more forces. They got cut off. Their commanding officer, Gordon Sharp, was unfortunately killed. So Bob Buick, the sergeant who'd fired the first couple of shots, took command of the platoon. They were cut off from all sides. The Viet Cong were attempting to flank them, and the other platoons were trying to work out what the hell was going on. I won't go into all the detail of the Battle of Long Tan because it gets quite complicated, but suffice it to say that the Australian units were spread out in this big rubber plantation. There were VC units all over the place that were trying to outflank them, and it seemed that every time a VC unit would move to outflank one of the platoons, it would run into another Australian platoon. And this actually worked really well in the Australians' favour. Normal military doctrine says don't divide your forces, stick together. But because the Australians split up and went out by different platoons, it meant that the VC never worked out where the flanks were. They could never quite get a handle on how big the force the Australians were that they were facing. And so it actually worked hugely to their advantage, being separated in this way. So the platoons were scattered throughout the rubber plantation. Each of them got involved in their own deadly encounter with the Viet Cong troops. And all the while, they were calling in artillery fire, which blasted into the Viet Cong. So the battle ended when the Australians eventually pulled back to a sort of a headquarters area, and at about that time, some armoured personnel carriers, which had been sent out from Nui Dat, arrived very late in the day on the battlefield, and they ran into another Viet Cong force, which was attempting to outflank the Australians, and scattered that force, and then were able to come in and rescue the Aussies and save the day. So it was a cavalry unit, and literally the cavalry arrived and saved the day. There were also airstrikes and a very important airdrop by a couple of helicopters from Nui Dat. But it was really the artillery that was responsible for causing most of those casualties on the North Vietnamese and really protecting the Australians. So standing in the rubber plantation, what you've got up ahead is if you can just imagine standing in a rubber plantation, and at the far corner to your direct right is the Long Tan Cross, the famous site that everyone visits on the battlefield. In fact, the site that most people only visit on the battlefield. And I didn't want to head to the cross just yet because I wanted to get a feeling for what had happened elsewhere on the battlefield. So instead of going sort of diagonally right towards the cross, I went left towards the main feature on the battlefield, the main geographic feature, which is a small hill called Nui Dat 2. And Nui Dat 2 was where a lot of the VC fire was coming from originally. This was obviously a main defensive position for the Viet Cong. So I wanted to head in that direction to see if I could just get a bit more of a feel for the battlefields. Battlefields are funny places. They do tell a story by walking the ground. That's why we walk the ground, so we can learn the stories that we can't learn from the history books. And this one told a really great story because I'd read in the accounts that as the platoons pulled back towards where their headquarters was, they were protected from enemy fire because they were on a slight reverse slope. The ground sloped downwards. They were slightly down the hill, and they were protected from enemy machine gun fire. And as I walked through this rubber plantation, much to my surprise, the ground started sloping away. So it was fairly obvious where a unit, when they were under fire, when they were getting pressure from all sides, where they would choose to dig in and make their stand. So I was fairly confident that I found exactly the spot where company headquarters had originally been set up and where the other platoons pulled back to eventually during the battle, which was really great. Again, the ground telling you a story. Just a slope in the ground, a little hill, can tell you a whole chapter of this amazing story. So it was great to walk the ground there. And then I kept walking on towards the hill that I could see in the distance, Nui Dat 2. The rubber went through patches of being quite thick, and then it was thin, and then the fields were completely clear at one stage, where the farmer had been intending to plant some crops. So I was able to walk across this fairly open ground at this stage, which gave me a great perspective on the battlefield, and across this rich red soil that I'd seen so much about. And the interesting thing about that as I walked across it was I looked down and noted that I had the same boots on that I'd been wearing at Gallipoli last week, and they still had a bit of dirt on them from the Gallipoli battlefields. And I thought, what a wonderful, strange link that was with Anzac history, walking across the ground, this bright red earth at Long Tan, wearing the boots that still carried the dust from Gallipoli a week earlier. A nice little bookmark, a mingling of the two earths, that the nice little bookends to this important chapter of Anzac history. So as I kept heading towards the hill Nui Dat 2, walked through this clear fields, just as I was strolling along, I glanced down, and lying there sticking out of the dirt was a piece of high explosive shell. It was a big chunk of metal that had obviously come flying off a high explosive shell fired by the Australians. So that was a fantastic thing. So I photographed that, a piece of history you can touch in your hands. I didn't expect to find any relics from the battle. I mean, the battle was only about 4 hours, over 50 years ago, so I didn't expect that there would be much lying around. So that was amazing to find a piece of, we could say, shrapnel from an Australian shell, which particularly in this battle where the Australian artillery was essential in saving the day. And so I kept heading over towards Nui Dat 2. When I got to Nui Dat, I thought, well, I can't just stand here at the bottom, so I climbed up to the top, and what a magnificent view. It's not a very big hill, but as you go up it, it's incredible in this relatively flat countryside. What a view it gave you. So I could see exactly why the Viet Cong would have chosen to make that their main defensive position. And in fact, about halfway up, I found what I'm fairly confident was a Viet Cong machine gun position. It was a shallow hole right on the edge of the hillside, good cover behind it. And like in so many places, France, the Pacific, Gallipoli, you can find places that are fairly obvious where machine gunners would set up to provide a good field of fire and protection as well from enemy fire. And this seemed to be one of those sites as well. So I'm fairly confident that that was a VC machine gun position. So from there, they rained fire down on the Australians as they advanced through the rubber towards the site of where is now the Long Tan Cross. So it was great going up Nui Dat 2. And as I went up with Tuan, my guide, he said no one's come up here before. He's taken lots of veterans from the battle. He's taken lots of historians and tour groups to the battlefield at Long Tan, but that was the first time in 20 years of guiding that he'd climbed Nui Dat 2, which was really something special. I was glad. I thought it was an obvious thing to do, but apparently most people don't go up there. So it's also a working quarry, so you have to be careful when you go up there that you don't get blown up or run over by a heavy piece of machinery. But no one was working today, so we were able to scarper up the side of Nui Dat 2 and have a good look out over the battlefield. A really fantastic perspective. From there, we could see the entire Australian area of operations in Phuoc Tuy province. We could see all the way back to Nui Dat. We could see the long high hills off in the distance. We could see the Horseshoe, which was another fire support base. And in the other direction, we could see Nui Lay, which was the final Australian battlefield of the war in 1971. So climbing up Nui Dat 2 was really quite a lovely experience. It just gave you a great perspective. Again, when you visit a battlefield, you want perspective, and this was a great one. So then we scrambled back down the hill, getting pretty scratched up on the thorns on the way down, and then we walked directly across the top of the battlefield towards the Long Tan Cross. And on the way, we made a little detour. We went past the house where a local family lives, just local farmers, and it's their job to maintain the cross. So they They pump water from their well, which they use to water the gardens around the cross. They clean the cross regularly. They maintain it. They cut the weeds. And it really is quite a beautiful little spot, the Long Tarn Cross. And it's very well maintained by this local family. So we called in just to say hello, and so I could express my thanks to them. And they were incredibly welcoming. They insisted that we sit down and they chatted. They didn't speak any English, of course, and I don't speak Vietnamese, but lucky I had Tuan there. They insisted on giving me fruit and welcoming me as an Australian. And it was just a wonderful experience to see how much we've moved on from the hostility of this war. I get asked all the time, how do the Vietnamese people feel about their former enemies coming back? And my answer is almost universally, they are very, very welcoming. It's incredible how there are no hard feelings left over from the war. Animosity has disappeared. Yesterday, when I was walking the battlefields with my group, I had a veteran with me, and we ran into another veteran in the Long Tan area who had served with Viet Cong forces, and they actually ended up buying each other a beer, and we stayed together for an hour or so and had a great chat. So there's no animosity. It's like Gallipoli, for example, in Turkey. There's no animosity between former enemies, and that's particularly the case in Vietnam. So it was wonderful to sit down with this family. They were very welcoming. We ate fruit, we chatted, and they talked all about the strange Australian visitors that they often get coming through. They can't quite understand why so many Australians want to come to their little field in the corner of this province to look at this strange white cross that stands there. But they were very, very welcoming, and it was a lovely thing to do. And it's important we connect with the local people when we visit these historic sites. And after we said our farewells, we walked down to the cross, and you can never go to the Long Tarn Cross without just feeling a huge sense of respect and admiration and sadness as well. Yesterday, when I was there, we did a small informal remembrance service, and I shed a tear like I always do during these things. It's just a really special experience to stand on that ground where so many people died, not just Australians, of course. 18 Australians were killed during the battle, but upwards of 250 Vietnamese were killed, and some estimates say it could have been as high as 500. So many people died in this tiny corner, and it is tiny. When you walk the Long Tan battlefield, you realise what a small area it is to have cost so many lives. So it's always emotional. When I was there yesterday, I shed a little tear as we did our service, and today it was very emotional as well, just to be there, just Tuan and I, just the two of us. Our flowers that we laid yesterday were still there, wilting in the heat, and it was just lovely to stand there at this special site. The cross is a replica. The original of the cross was taken away. Originally the cross was put up in 1969 on the 3rd anniversary of the battle in honour of the Australians that were killed. And after the war, the cross disappeared for a while and then turned up in a local museum. In the meantime, a replica was built on the site, and that replica still stands there today. And as of a few years ago, the original cross was donated by the people of Vietnam back to the Australians, and it's now in the Australian War Memorial. So when you go to the War Memorial in Canberra, make sure you go and check out the Vietnam exhibition, and in a little room off the back, easy to miss, ask directions if you can't find it, is a room dedicated to the Long Tarn Cross, and the original cross now stands there in that room. So it doesn't matter that it's a replica, it doesn't have to be the real one, it's what it stands for that's important. And the thing we should remember as well is having this cross in Vietnam, considering the outcome of the war, would effectively be like the Japanese wanting to put up a memorial in Darwin only to their soldiers and to commemorate the bombing of Darwin every February 19 without mentioning the Aussies. Or it would be the same as the Germans in France wanting to put up a memorial to Blitzkrieg and wanting to come back and commemorating it. So it's quite a privilege that the Vietnamese people have allowed this cross to remain, this memorial to the Australians. And having said that, there's only 2 foreign war memorials in all of Vietnam. There's one up in Dien Bien Phu to the French, way up in the north of Vietnam, and there's a Long Tarn Cross. They're the only 2 foreign memorials in Vietnam from the Vietnam War. So it's an incredible privilege that the Vietnamese have left this cross in place and maintain it and look after it as well as they do, and allow people like myself and veterans and visitors to come and pay their respects at the cross. So Tuan and I spent a good half hour or so at the cross just chatting about the battle and relaxing and just appreciating where we were, and just looking back up to Nui Dat 2, where we just climbed, and out across the rubber plantation. The views are pretty good at the moment from the Long Tarn Cross, even though when the cross was erected, it was in the middle of a dense rubber plantation. Now it's out in the open. The rubber trees were cut down a few years ago and are slowly growing back. They're probably about chest height at the moment, but for the time being, there's excellent views out across the battlefield. So it was really quite a special day. I spent 3 or 4 hours walking around the battlefield, and I hadn't done it before. I'd been to the Long Tarn Cross, I'd been to the Long Tarn battlefield, but I'd never walked the ground. And until you walk the ground, you can't understand what those soldiers went through. You have to get out and walk through the dirt and get down low and see the battlefield as the soldiers saw it. So that's what I got to do today. It was a great privilege. Twan is a wonderful guide, and as I said, if you travel with Matt McLaughlin Battlefield Tours, Twan will be the local guide who will come with you, and he knows his stuff really well. It was a privilege to get out there with him, and just a privilege to walk in the footsteps of these great men, and hopefully the men that were killed in the battle know that they're not forgotten, and hopefully by doing things like I did today, or the commemorative service we did yesterday, or even you by listening to this podcast, you're keeping their memory alive. And it's something that shouldn't be taken for granted. It's a wonderful thing that we do by remembering these people. And so that was my day. Really lovely. I hope you get the chance to come to Vietnam. It's a very welcoming country. There's wonderful history to see here, and specifically to walk that battlefield at Long Tan, because it's a great experience, and I really encourage you to do it. Well, that's really it for me from this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. As of next week, we'll be back to our regular schedule of weekly podcasts that I'll be pre-recording. And so thank you for joining me for this very special series that we've done live over Anzac Day. I hope you've enjoyed them. I've really enjoyed making them. If you haven't heard all of them, go back and listen to the ones I did with Peter Hart last week from Gallipoli, because we had an extraordinary time exploring the Gallipoli battlefields. But until I speak to you again next week, thank you very much for listening.